Well, good evening, everyone. It's Wednesday night time for Bible study again. Certainly hope you are enjoying the Bible studies that we restarted here a couple weeks ago. It was one of the Wednesdays in September. Tonight, let's first begin by asking God's blessing. Our great God in heaven, we thank you very much now for the many, many blessings we have, the wonderful knowledge of your truth, the hope that we're going to be celebrating and looking forward to with the coming Feast of Tabernacles, the hope, Father, of your kingdom here on the earth. So we thank you now for the wonderful knowledge that you've given to us and the hope in this world that is certainly spiraling into some very difficult, dangerous, and challenging times. We just ask your blessing now tonight in Jesus Christ's name. Amen. Well, tonight I'm going to continue with some personal lessons from the Psalms, and I think you'll find that the Psalms that go through so many human emotions, all the way from excitement and thrill and ecstasy almost to the point of being down in the dungeon, walking through the valley of death, and being surrounded by enemies in some of the Psalms. So the entire gamut of human experience emotionally and pretty much otherwise, although obviously there are things that he didn't know about, but the entire experience that the Psalms tell us are experiences that we can relate to in various times in our life and various stages. I want to begin really over in Galatians chapter 1 and beginning in verse 15. It says, "When it pleased God who separated me from my mother's womb and called me through his grace." So Paul is saying that from the time he was born, God determined that he was going to call him, and that from the time that he was separated from his mother's womb, God was there and was working with him. Now, if that was true for Paul, was it true for all of us, all that have been called in this time we live in now? Well, I think the unquestionable answer is yes, that God was working with us from the time we were maybe conceived, like he said to Jeremiah, "I knew you and you were in the womb." But certainly, as Paul says here, from the time he was separated from his mother's womb. He says, "Call me through his grace to reveal his son in me." So the purpose that Paul was called was to reveal the Son of God in him, or the Holy Spirit living in him. And so the same would be, of course, true from us. He said that I might preach him among the Gentiles. I did not immediately confer with flesh and blood. So he's talking about when he finally understood God's calling, he didn't immediately go confer with flesh and blood, but he went to Arabia, where he spent a considerable time, probably 3 years, off and on with Jesus Christ. So tonight I want to talk about some of the experiences that King David learned and wrote down for us, because we are not going to be facing running from a king, hiding in caves, having to act like we are lunatic in order to escape being executed. But we are going to have experiences that are similar to what King David experienced. Let's go tonight, to begin with, now to Hebrews chapter 12. I want to begin in verse 1. This, as you know, is right after Hebrews 11, which is the famous chapter of all the what we call the chapter of faith, or the examples of faith. And of course, it ends with God having provided something better for us, that they should not be made perfect before us. So Hebrews 11 ends and begins with the same goal, to die with a good testimony. It says, "Therefore," verse 1 of chapter 12, "we also, since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, let us lay aside every weight." So there were weights besetting them as they tried to live their Christian life in the first century, just like there are weights besetting us. There are challenges, there are temptations, there are problems in the road. It says, "And the sin which so easily ensnares us." Now, if sin easily ensnared them back before they had media, back before they had television, they didn't even have radio, they had just runners going between village and city to city, trying to be able to get the message out. But he says here, "Let us run with endurance the race that is set before us, looking unto Jesus, the author and finisher of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross." So there was a joy set before him. The Apostle Paul later said that the church was his joy, and him presenting the church as a cherished bride, or as a chaste bride to Christ on the time of the resurrection, was going to be his greatest joy in life. So Jesus Christ had the same type of joy, looking forward to the resurrection, looking forward to a family of beings who had proven their loyalty to him and proven that they could be trusted to rule cities, to rule perhaps worlds. Who knows what the future might hold. He says he despised the shame. He didn't care about the shame he went through, he sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. For consider him who endured such hostility from sinners against himself. So he endured hostility from sinners. King David also endured hostility from sinners, and we'll read about a few of those events tonight. But it would not be a surprise if God's people in the future endure some hostility from sinners. It says, you have not yet resisted to bloodshed, striving against sin. So they hadn't yet had to shed their blood, striving against sin. There was coming a time when many of them would. You have forgotten the exhortation which speaks to you as sons. My son, don't despise the chastening of the Lord, nor be discouraged when you are rebuked by him. Now, Paul is talking from personal experience. He was someone who was chastened by God. He went through the same type of experience that he had put others through. He had had many beaten. He was 5 times beaten. He had had many who were chained and put in prison. He himself lived for a couple of years in prison. A number of the things he did persecuting Christians that he lists for us, we find him also experiencing in the book of Acts, and he's detailing to us in other places, especially in the 2 Corinthians. So he understood the chastening of God and the need for God to bring us to a place where we listen and really internalize the lessons he wants us to learn. If the life of a Christian were simply to be on the beach, kicking back in our lawn chair, sipping iced tea all day, we wouldn't learn much character, and God would not learn much about our character. He had to test Abraham several times to the place that he finally tested him with his greatest possession in life, which was his son. And then God said, now I know that you will follow me and obey me no matter what. You would not withhold anything from me. Verse 6 says, whom the Lord loves, he scourges. And he scourges every son whom he receives. So part of our experience as a Christian is to be trained, is to be, as the words here of Paul say, scourged, or you might say put through the ringer sometimes, go through some trials. If you endure chastening, God deals with you as sons. So we have to endure chastening. We don't jump ship. We don't give up. We endure chastening. For what son is there whom a father does not chasten? But if you are without chastening, of which you all have become partakers. So he said, if you signed up to be a Christian, you agreed to it, then we are partakers of this training that we must go through before God knows we can rule a city, 5 cities, whatever it might be. Furthermore, we have had human fathers who corrected us. Sadly, there's a big need for more correction among most of our youth in this country. We have this liberalized ideas of letting the children discover for themselves how they want to behave. That's very, very sad, and we're paying terrible consequences for it, of which all have become partakers. He said, we had human fathers who corrected us, and we paid them respect. Shall we not much more readily be in subjection to the Father of spirits and live? So we are to be in subjection to the Father of spirits. And that's something that we must, I think about, we must learn. And we're very thankful that we have that Father of spirits who is dealing with us. So I want to go over now to 1 Samuel chapter 16. We want to kind of take a little sketch of the life of King David. At this time, 1 Samuel 16, he wasn't king. He was just simply a shepherd boy, the youngest of a number of brothers. And he went through some challenging experiences. It's amazing to me how young he was. He was probably about 15 when his life account begins here. So he was very mature for his age. He had protected the sheep. He had beaten some wild animals that normally kill people. He had learned about God. I don't know, it doesn't tell us where he got his copy of the Torah, or if he had to go to the synagogue, or well, it wouldn't even been a synagogue. Then there would simply have been village elders, Levites, who would have read the book to them, and they would simply have had to learn. They would have had to do something about, know something about how to do it, how to apply it. So we don't really know, but we know he did know the scriptures fairly well, at least the scriptures that he had, probably the books of Moses he had occasional access to. But in 1 Samuel chapter 16, verse 10 says, the word of the Lord came to Samuel, saying, I greatly regret that I have set Saul up as king, for he has turned back from following me and has not performed my commandments. and it grieved Samuel, and he cried out to the Lord all night. So it shows you how much Samuel was a patriot, how much he cared for his country, and he knew that the loss of Samuel was going to cause much bloodshed in the people of Israel. Then Samuel rose early in the morning to meet Saul, and it was told to Samuel, Saul went up to Carmel and indeed has set up a monument for himself, and he has gone on Gilgal and gone by Gilgal. So here we have, I'm sorry, I'm in chapter 15, which is actually where I wanted to start anyway, chapter 15 of 1 Samuel. So Saul was rejected because of what he had done. Down in verse 26, Samuel said to Saul, I will not return with you, for you have rejected the word of the Lord, and the Lord has rejected you from being king over Israel. So Saul did not obey. He partially obeyed. We all have had children who were very good at partially obeying. They do a little bit or partially of what you say, but they certainly have a way sometimes of skirting around the spirit of the law and just obeying just the physical part only. So Saul was told he's been rejected from being king. So God told Samuel then to go and to anoint a new person to be king. Let's go down to verse 6. So it was when they came that he looked at Eliab and said, surely the Lord's anointed is before me. So Samuel had gone to Bethlehem, and he had taken a heifer with him, saying he was going to sacrifice. He went to the family of Jesse, a landowner who had sheep and probably flocks, whatever, there in that area. And the Lord said to Samuel, after Samuel said to himself, oh, this guy Eliab, he's tall, he's handsome, he's good looking, he's the firstborn son, so he must be the one who would be the king that God would choose. But God said to him, do not look at his appearance or at his physical stature, because I have refused him. For the Lord does not see as man sees, for man looks on the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart. So God is telling us something very important here, a verse that we should never forget, that God looks at the heart. He looks at the inside, the intent, the desire. Do we love God with all of our heart or not? So Eliab didn't, and there's a little more about Eliab in this scenario that kind of reveals his character and his jealousy. But Jesse called his other sons Abinadab, and the Lord said, no, that's not him. Then Shammah passed before him. God said, nope, that's one either. And his other 7 sons passed before him, all total his 7 sons. And Samuel said, this is not the one the Lord said. And Samuel said to Jesse, are all the young men here? So Jesse had 8 sons. He said, there remains the youngest, and there he is keeping the sheep. And so Samuel said to Jesse, send and bring him. We will not sit down until he comes here. So they were standing. The sons were all passing before Samuel, and God was in who knows what kind of verbal way telling Samuel, nope, this is not it. Nope, this is not him. So he sent and brought him in. So just the kind of the picture you get is they're kind of looking across the hills and they could see him, half a mile away or whatever it was with the sheep. So they sent a messenger over, and David comes in. Then he sent and brought him in. Now he was ready with bright eyes and good looking. And the Lord said, arise, anoint him, for this is the one. So ruddy means normally like red hair, maybe some freckles, we don't know. But he was good looking, and the Lord said, this is the one. So Samuel took the horn of oil and anointed him in the midst of his brothers. So his brothers all knew that this was the one God had chosen, that Samuel, through God's instructions, had chosen David, and this was going to be the next king of Israel. He said, anoint him in the midst of his brothers. The Spirit of the Lord came upon David from that day forward. So Samuel rose and went to Ramah. Now, there wasn't a parade. David didn't go grab the army and say, hey, I've been anointed king, let's gather around. And, like the Roman palace guard used to do whenever the emperor died, is the Roman palace guard would then pretty much, choose and hurrah, hurrah, who the next emperor was going to be. And of course, down through time, it was whole armies who chose their general to be the next emperor of Rome. And then, of course, there were civil wars, like the year of the 4 emperors in 69 AD. And so there was kind of the same thing could have happened here, but didn't. David waited. He didn't run out and say, I'm king now. Get rid of Saul. I'm the man. Nope. He just simply waited for God to work in his life. A very important lesson. This may be the first indication of David's heart that he was not self-exalting. He wasn't going to take this and say, rah, rah. He just waited. So Samuel arose and went to Ramah. Samuel didn't go around with the trumpet. The Spirit of the Lord departed from Saul, and a distressing spirit from the Lord troubled him. So God allowed a demon to pester and to trouble Saul. Saul's servant said to him, surely a distressing spirit from God is troubling you. Let your master now command your servants who are before you to seek out a man who was a skillful player on the harp. Now, the harps back then were very small. If you've seen the Irish flag, actually the flag of Ulster, Ireland, that has the picture of David's harp on there, it's fairly small. It would be one that you could maybe be a foot, 14 inches. It wasn't a great big harp like we think of harps today that are very, very heavy and cumbersome and difficult to transport. So he was able to go find David, that there was a man who was son of Jesse, a Bethlehemite, who was skillful in playing, a mighty man of valor. Now, so David must have been well known, at least by some of these palace guard people. They knew that he could play well on the harp. They knew that he was a mighty man of valor, that he had fought these animals, maybe after he killed a bear and drug him back in. I don't know if he had it mounted or not, or had it made into a skin, but somebody must have known that he was a man of valor. He said he's a man of war, prudent in speech. So he was known for being mature in the things that he said, prudent in what he said, even though he was only a lad of 15 to 17 years old. I think most commentaries believe he was about 17. Others say about 15, but certainly about, we know he became king, actually was crowned at age 30. And that he had 13 years living in the wilderness running from King Saul. So that would be a very, very long time. And so he must have been, approaching 17 years old here when these events occurred. So David came to Saul, verse 21, and stood before him, and he loved him greatly. So the first relationship between Saul and David was that Saul loved David greatly, it says. Later, of course, he tried to kill him and spent years trying to kill him. And so it was whenever the Spirit from God was upon Saul that David would take a harp and play it with his hand, and Saul would be refreshed. So here we have David, and he became the servant of Saul. He actually moved to the palace, wherever it was that the king lived, given the short time that Saul had been king I guess it had been in the 30 years. Maybe he would have had a nice palace by then, but certainly when he was made king, there wouldn't have been a palatial estate for a king anywhere. Would just had his own house. So in chapter 17, it says the Philistines gathered their armies together to battle, and they gathered at Sokoh, which belongs to Judah. And they camped between Sokoh and Azekah in Ephes Dammim. If you've been to the valley of Elah and the place here where the Philistines and this battle took place, it is really very worthwhile to go see. I would wait till the wars are finished before going over there, as the wars that's currently going on. In fact, we are nearing in a couple weeks the first anniversary of that mass murder of over 1,200 Israelis and a few Americans over in the Gaza Strip, just outside the Gaza Strip. So it'll be 1 year that this war has been going on. And of course, Israel in the past has won pretty quick wars, and because their soldiers are primarily citizen soldiers. And so many of them are not at their jobs producing, they're out fighting. But it was amazing, it's been almost a year. But anyway, we have David here and the Philistines. Most of you know the story, but let's drop down here to verse 19. Saul and all the men of Israel were in the valley of Elah fighting with the Philistines, and David rose up early in the morning, left the sheep with the keeper, and took the things and went as Jesse had commanded him. In other words, take some food and some supplies to your brothers who are fighting in the army. He came to the camp as the army was going out to fight and shouting for the battle. For Israel and the Philistines had drawn up in battle array, army against army. So they were each on the top of the hill with this valley between them. And kind of the first person to go down the valley would be a disadvantage because the other army then would be attacking downhill. So David left his supplies in the hand of the supply keeper and ran to the army and came and greeted his brothers. Then he talked with them. There was the champion, the Philistine of Gath, Goliath by name, coming up from the armies of the Philistines. and he spoke according to the same words. So David heard them. And of course, Goliath was taunting, and he was making fun of the soldiers of Israel, saying if any one of them would come out, that he would fight them, and the winner would determine the outcome of the war. But all the men of Israel, when they saw the man, fled from him and were dreadfully afraid. So they were afraid of this great big man. May have been 9 feet tall. People think somewhere between 8 and 9 feet tall. A big muscular, huge sword, big shield. The men of Israel said, have you seen this man who has come up? Surely he has come up to defy Israel. And it shall be that the man who kills him, the king will enrich with great riches. He will give him his daughter and his father's house exemption from taxes in Israel. So this was a reward, fairly significant reward, says lots of money and his daughter in marriage, which means he would then be part of the royal family, so to speak. David spoke to the men who stood by him, saying, what shall be done for the man who kills this Philistine and takes away the reproach of Israel? For who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God? So David told the Israelite men that they were the armies of the living God. They probably hadn't thought of it in those terms. And the people answered him in this manner, saying, so shall it be done for the man who kills him. So they listed their rewards that were going to be given to the man who would kill Goliath. Now, Eliab is the old brother. Remember, Eliab was the first one that Samuel said, oh, this must be it. And God said, no, Eliab, he's not the guy. So Eliab, his oldest brother, heard what he spoke to the men, and Eliab's anger was aroused against David. And he said, why have you come down here? And with whom have you left those few sheep in the wilderness? I know your pride and the insolence of your heart. In other words, I am jealous of you and the valor that you've accomplished and your reputation on the harp and the way people like you. So this is the way he says, I'm jealous. He says that I know your pride and the insolence of your heart. In other words, he's accusing David's character. And it just tells you that there are gainsayers, there are critics, there are those who constantly criticize those who obey God. And they often do it with slander, with innuendo, with personal character attacks, not with any factual truth. There's no fact stated here. All we have is Eliab's jealousy that's demonstrated. David said, what have I done? Is there not a cause? He says, is there a cause for what you're saying? Of course not. And he turned from him towards another and said the same thing. And these people answered him as the first ones did. So David asked several people, what shall be done for the man who kills Goliath? So then David went to Saul, and I think we are all familiar with the story. Let's drop down to verse 43. So David went out to fight the Philistine, to fight Goliath. Verse 42, when the Philistine looked about and saw David, he disdained him, for he was only a youth, ruddy and good looking. So the Philistine said to David, am I a dog that you come to me with sticks? And the Philistine cursed David by his gods. So he invoked the gods of the Philistines, probably, is it Chennereth? There's several of the Chemosh. Beelzebub is another one of the gods of the Philistines. It's also a name for Satan the devil. The Philistine said to David, come to me, I will give your flesh to the birds of the air and the beasts to eat. David said to the Philistine, you come to me with a sword and a spear and with a javelin, but I come to you in the name of the Lord God, Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defiled. So Goliath invokes the authority of his gods. David invokes the authority of the God of Israel. So they understood this as a test of gods, as a test of national deities. And a lot of the battles of ancient times were viewed in this manner, that the battle was between the gods of those lands and who had the strongest deity on their side. So then he says here in verse 47, all this assembly shall know that the Lord does not save with sword and spear, for the battle is not the Lord's. He will give you into our hands. And so the battle is the Lord's, and that's what David said. And so he killed Goliath. He killed Goliath, hit him in the head with a stone, probably knocked him out, and took his sword and out of the hand of the Philistine and cut his head off. And so that was pretty much the end of the battle with the Philistines, at least for that day. So what's interesting is next that Saul went out. David and Jonathan became, best of buddies. Chapter 18, when he had finished speaking to Saul, the soul of Jonathan was knit with the soul of David. Now, Jonathan loved him as his own. So Jonathan was the firstborn. He would have been in line to be the king of Israel. The next king of Israel would have been quite an honor. So Saul took him that day and would not let him go to his father's house anymore. So David became part of the household of Saul. And Jonathan and David made a covenant because he loved him as his own soul. So they made an agreement to always support each other, to always be with each other in the sense of if there was a battle or a conflict, to be on each other's side supporting. So Jonathan took off the robe that was on him. Now that robe probably was a royal robe that signified he was the crown prince, the dauphin, as the French used to call them. Much like Joseph had a coat of many colors that signified he was the firstborn, the one, at least he wasn't the firstborn, but he was in line to receive the major blessing from his father because of his character. And of course, Reuben and others were very jealous of that. But he put on this robe, and then he also gave it to David with his armor, even his sword and his bow and his belt. So he let David have his sword and his bow, which David apparently all he had was a sling, but he also took this armament from Jonathan. Maybe Jonathan knew that David would need to have it as he was going to be in the army. So David went out wherever Saul sent him, and he behaved wisely. And Saul set him over the men of war. So Jonathan might have known ahead of time that Saul was going to put David over the men of war. And he was accepted in the sight of all the people and in the sight of Saul's servants. Now, it happened as they were coming home when David was returning from the slaughter of the Philistines that the women had come out of all the cities of Israel singing and dancing. And they did this to celebrate, obviously. There are several biblical accounts of women parading the streets, singing and dancing after a victory. Just like after Pharaoh was drowned in the sea, Miriam led the women of Israel on a parade, singing and dancing to celebrate their military victory. The women sang, Saul has slain his thousands and David his 10,000s. And it shows you the character of Saul here, or you might say lack of character, that Saul was very, very angry. He was very jealous. And the Bible is very plain in Proverbs not to be jealous of the success of another person. Don't envy those who are successful. And of course, Saul was very guilty of doing that. She says, if they have said that, what else could he have but the kingdom? So Saul's worried now about his throne. So Saul eyed David from that day forward. So Saul has transitioned here from loving David to being very envious and very suspicious of David. And of course, the spirit would come on him, and David would have to play this harp to get this distressing spirit. Verse 14 says, David behaved wisely in all his ways, and the Lord was with him. Therefore, when Saul saw that he behaved wisely, he was afraid of him. So now this envy and jealousy has turned to a certain amount of fear. So it was love, then it was envy and jealousy. Now it's a certain amount of fear that Saul shows towards David. Then Saul said to David, here is my older daughter, Merab. I will give her to you as wife. Only be valiant for me and fight the Lord's battles. So Saul thought, let my hand not be against him. Let the hand of the Philistines be against him. So David said, who am I? What is my life, my father's family in Israel, that I should be son-in-law to the king? But at the time when Saul's daughter, Merab, should have been given to David, she was given to Adriel the Maholathite as a wife. So David was tricked. David was basically promised, and then the promise was reneged on. And that was one of the promises that Saul had made. If whoever kills the Philistine, Goliath, would have his oldest daughter. So it happened at that time that Saul's daughter should have been given to David, that Michal, Saul's daughter, loved David. And it was told Saul, and the thing pleased him. So as Saul was living in the household, and there were various women, family members there, he became enamored with, and she became enamored with him. So David became a slave in the house. But his relationship with David turned eventually to hatred. Let's drop down to verse 28. Saul saw and knew that the Lord was with David, and that Michal, Saul's daughter, loved him, and Saul was still more afraid of David. So Saul became David's enemy continually. So this is the final phase of this transition in this relationship. Saul becomes David's enemy. To the princes of the Philistines went out to war, so David went out. He behaved wisely all the time. So we have Saul here in chapter 19 then trying to get other people to kill David for him. Saul spoke to Jonathan, his son, and to all the servants that they should kill David. But Jonathan, Saul's son, delighted greatly in David. So Jonathan told David, my father seeks to kill you, and therefore please be on your guard until morning. Stay in a secret place and hide. So Saul now is organizing a party of army soldiers to go out and try to kill David, and Jonathan warns him. So we have this we have kind of an argument, a discussion between Saul and David, or Jonathan and Saul. And Jonathan, of course, was trying to defend David. But verse 10, Saul sought to pin David with the wall with a spear, and he slipped away from Saul's presence. So David fled and escaped that night. So David came back into the palace, the home of the king, and Saul tried to throw a spear at him, and he missed him, thankfully. David then took off and basically didn't go back. So here we have Saul now trying to kill David. Let's drop down to verse 12. Michal let David down through a window, and he went and fled and escaped. So she must have made some kind of rope or something, let him out through a window. Michal took an image and laid it on the bed, put a cover of goat's hair for his head, and covered it with clothes. So she stuffed stuff in the bed to make it look like he was there sleeping. And so Saul sent messengers back, and she said, well, David is sick. And so she covered up for David, gave him time to escape from her father. So verse 18, David fled and escaped, and went to Samuel at Ramah and told him all that Samuel had done. Now, the first person that David ends up going to 3 different people, but the first one he goes to for advice, for refuge, what do I do, is Samuel, is God's judge, God's priest at that time, or God, he actually judge over the land, or had been one of the judges. So Samuel, it was told to Saul, saying, take note, David is at Naboth. So Naboth, I think it is. So Saul sent messengers there, and he also went to Ramah, but at that time, of course, he had already gone. Verse 20, David fled from Naioth in Ramah and said to Jonathan, what have I done? And of course, most of us know the story about the dinner for 2 nights in a row where he was gone. And so Jonathan basically told him, you better just start fleeing. So down in verse, let me see, so he's just basically now just starting to flee. He's just fleeing from the area of Bethlehem, or the area where he was ruling from there at, would be closer to modern day, not Shechem, but over in where the cave of Machpelah area is, what we would call today Hebron. But let's go over to Psalm chapter 59, because David wrote a number of these psalms as he was fleeing from King Saul, and during these 13 years of basically life on the run, of not having a normal life at all, being responsible for a number of men who were following him. But Psalm 59, thankfully the notes here have been kept for us. So to the chief musician set to Do Not Destroy, a miktam, or a psalm set to music of David, when Saul sent men and they watched the house in order to kill him. Now this is when Michal had put stuffed under the bed, put sheets or whatever under there and goat skins, so it looked like there was somebody sleeping in the bed. And of course there wasn't, but the men were watching the house all night. So David wrote this psalm, Psalm 59. This is the first of a number of psalms he wrote while he was living life on the run. He says here, deliver me from my enemies, O God. So he has enemies coming after him. And this may be one of the first times he prays to God or writes to God, deliver me from my enemies. Defend me from those who rise up against me. Deliver me from the workers of iniquity, and save me from bloodthirsty men. So this psalm tells us something about what was on his mind and the lessons that he needed to learn. Remember, David is going to be king over all the earth. He is going to rule during the millennium, but he had to be proving his character and proving his dependence upon God so he could do that. He says in verse 3, look, they lie in wait for my life. They were lying around the house where Michal and David had lived, and were waiting for him. They were going to kill him, the mighty gather against me, not for my transgression, nor for my sin, They run and prepare themselves through no fault of mine. So David said, I've done nothing wrong to them or to the king, but they are now surrounding the house, hoping to kill me. Awake to help me, and behold, therefore, O God of Israel, O Lord God of hosts, the God of Israel, awake to punish all the nations. Do not be merciful to any of the wicked transgressors. Then he kind of describes these soldiers that are after him. At evening they return. They growl like a dog. They go all around the city. Indeed, they belch with their mouth. So maybe they're drinking some ale or something. Who knows? Swords are in their lips, for they say, who hears? But you, O Lord, shall laugh at them. You shall have all the nations in derision. So he knew something about the future. This psalm is also inspired about the millennium. The nations would be in derision. I will wait for you, O strength, for God is my defense. So this is the first lesson that David is learning here. And it's one that we are all going to have to learn as we prepare for the millennium, as we prepare for the time of Jacob's trouble, as we prepare for some of the challenging times that are no doubt ahead of us fairly soon in the next few years. God is my defense. We don't need to stock up large amounts of self-defense equipment, whether it's guns, ammunition, whatever else it might be. The only true defense is going to be our relationship with God. My God of my mercy shall come to meet me. God shall let me see my desire of my enemies. Do not slay them, lest my people forget. Scatter them by your power. So he's simply telling them, please scatter these enemies around him, which of course that actually happened. They did when they realized David wasn't there. They did scatter. In verse 16, towards the end of the psalm, he says, but I will sing of your power, not of his own. He was a good warrior. He killed a lot of animals, maybe a few other soldiers, we don't know. Yes, I will sing aloud of your mercy in the morning, for you have been my defense. Twice he says here, God is my defense. And that's this lesson that he learned as he was first undergoing persecution from Saul. He said, you have been my defense and refuge in the day of trouble. To you, O my strength, I will sing praises, for God is my defense, my God of mercy. So 3 times in this chapter, he tells us what was on his mind, and that was that God was his defense. We'll look at some parallel verses. Let's go back over to Joshua chapter 10 and verse 8. Joshua learned the same lesson, a little bit different way, but God made sure that Joshua also learned it. In Joshua chapter 10 and verse 8, it says, the Lord said to Joshua, do not fear them, for I have delivered them into your hand. Not a man of them shall stand before you. And so this is, of course, when the sun stood still and the attack on Gibeah and the great victory that God gave them. And God called down rocks from heaven basically to attack the enemy army. But God had to tell him not to fear. Do not fear them. Now let's also go to Daniel chapter 10, verse 14. Daniel was told not to fear either. And we might think of Daniel as a paragon of courage, and that's true. But God told him not to fear, despite what was happening, all of the terrible things that were going to be happening that he saw in vision. He simply told, fear not. So Daniel chapter 10, let's begin in verse 14. He says, I've come to make you understand what will happen to your people in the latter days. For the vision refers to many days yet to come. So this vision that Daniel saw wasn't for his time. It was for many days yet to come, which of course could be the times that we are living in. In fact, almost certainly is. For when he had spoken such words to me, I turned my face towards the ground and became speechless. So he was just stunned by what he'd seen, by this vision, and then to be told, well, it's for many, many years in the future. And suddenly one of them, having the likeness of the sons of men, touched my lips. So he wasn't the Son of Man. That's referred to in another chapter here, chapter 8. But he was saying it was like him. So an angel basically touched his mouth. Then I opened my mouth and spoke, saying to him who stood before me, my Lord, because of the vision, my sorrows have overwhelmed me, and I have no strength. So the vision basically overwhelmed him, caused him to faint or to almost feel like he had no strength. How can this servant of your Lord talk with you, my Lord? As for me, no strength remains in me now, nor is there any breath left in me. So he just felt very, very weak. Then again, the one having the likeness of a man touched me and strengthened me, and said, O man greatly beloved, fear not. Peace be to you. Be strong. Yes, be strong. So when he spoke to me, I was strengthened, and he said, let my Lord speak, for you have strengthened me. So this is the kind of strength that God offers. This is a good example that when we feel like we cannot go any farther, when we are very, very weak, we've done all we can do, there's nothing left humanly can be done. Sometimes we come to this point when it comes to physical challenges, maybe things like cancer or whatever, life-threatening issues, or perhaps it's something else, relationships or something with relatives or children. We come to the point where we simply must say, Lord, please strengthen me because I can't do it on my own. Then he said, do you know why I've come to you? And now I must return to fight with the prince of Persia. When I have gone forth, indeed the prince of Greece will come. So he's basically saying that these demonic creatures that were influencing these nations were trying to prevent him from having the relationship here with the angel and Daniel, and having Daniel being told what was going to happen. So let's go to one more. Let's go to Hebrews chapter 13 and verse 5. A different time period, obviously. Hebrews 13 written probably 68 AD, right along in that year, to a church that was going to be having to flee and to head out into Pella and perhaps to scatter through other places in the Roman world, the Eastern Roman Empire. So Hebrews chapter 13, verse 5 says, let your conduct be without covetousness. So in the end times, don't worry about the physical things you have or be covetous or jealous of other people. Be content with such things as you have. For he himself has said, I will never leave you or forsake you. So God has promised a number of places. One of the last things Jesus was recorded for saying in Matthew 28 is that I will never leave you or forsake you. Going into all the world, I'll be with you always. So we may boldly say, the Lord is my helper. I will not fear what man can do to me. And so fearing what man can do to us could be a very deadly thing in the life of a Christian. So we must understand that this is a lesson they learned. I will not fear what man can do to me. And in fact, it is something that God himself wants all of us to learn. Now I want to go back to 1 Samuel chapter 19. So we find here that, picking up the story, that Michal, his wife, helped him to escape. And he was able to escape after he wrote this psalm. He wrote this psalm while he's holed up in this room, or while he's watching these men surround this room that he's in. 1 Samuel chapter 19 and verse 12, Michal let David down through a window, and he went down, he fled and escaped. And so we have the escape of David. And then down in verse 16, it says, when the messengers had come in, there was an image in the bed with a cover of goat's hair for his head. And of course, Saul then verbally lambasted his daughter for protecting her husband, which of course she should have done. And in verse 18, David goes to see Samuel. That's the first place that he goes. Now, let's drop down to chapter 20. Let's begin in verse 1. David fled from Naioth in Ramah and went and said to Jonathan, what have I done? So first thing that David did is go see Samuel, and then he went to go see Jonathan to ask him what he had done. And he said, what is my sin that your father seeks my life? So Jonathan said to him, by no means you shall not die. And of course, the truth of the matter is Saul wanted to kill David so that Jonathan could be the one to inherit the crown. He wanted his son to follow him. And of course, Jonathan said no, he wasn't going to kill David for that. Jonathan said to David, verse 4, whatever you yourself desire, I will do it for you. And David said to Jonathan, tomorrow is a new moon, and I should not fail to sit with the king to eat, but let me go that I may hide in the field until the third day at evening. So it was the day of trumpets, the day of the new moon, maybe the day of the new moon being the first day of the year. But certainly it was one that they knew ahead of time was coming, so it wasn't one they observed. It was a calculated new moon. It says, if your father misses me at all, then say David went to Bethlehem. But of course, when it all happened, Saul got very, very upset and called David some names. And so we have Jonathan and David then making a covenant with each other. Verse 16, Jonathan made a covenant with the house of David, saying, let the Lord require at the hand of David's enemies. Now Jonathan caused David to vow, because he loved him, for he so loved him as his own soul. And so Saul got very upset, and David then had to continually be on the run. And before long, it was pretty much life on the run after that. Let's drop down to verse 24. David hid in the field, and when the new moon had come, the king sat down at the feast. And of course, you know what happened, that Jonathan got really lambasted by Saul. Saul called David some names. Verse 30, Saul's anger was aroused against Jonathan, and he called him names because he was upset because Jonathan was protecting, and he knew he was protecting David. And let's drop down to verse 33. Saul will cast a spear at him too, by which Jonathan knew that it was determined by his father to kill David. And so Saul cast a spear towards Jonathan, his own son. We don't know if he intended to kill him or not, just as he cast a spear in that way. And of course, then down to verse 42 at the end of this chapter, Jonathan said to David, this is after they're out in the field and the arrows are thrown, and Jonathan says, go on farther, farther. David at this point becomes runner. He's a life on the run. He has no home. He has no place of refuge. And he said, may the Lord be between you and me and between your descendants and my descendants forever. And so they made a covenant and a promise to protect each other and their families. It was probably an emotional goodbye. Now, the next step, David went to Nob, to Ahimelech the priest. First, he went to Samuel, the prophet and judge. But now he went to Ahimelech the priest. And Ahimelech was afraid when David said to him, why are you alone and no one is with you? So David said to Ahimelech the priest, the king has ordered me on some business and said to me, do not let anyone know anything about the business on which I send you or on which I have commanded you. Now, David wasn't being 100% truthful here, but he was doing it to protect Ahimelech. If he said, well, the king's trying to kill me and I'm escaping from him, so thank you for your help, then Ahimelech honestly would have to say, yes, I knew that he was running from the king. But now he could say, if anybody questioned him, David said he was on a special order, special task from the king, and who was I to know different? So he gave him 5 loaves of bread, verse 3, and the priest said to him, David said, there's no common bread on hand, but there is the holy bread, if the young men have at least kept themselves from women. Of course, there's a little band of guys with David who are on the run. David answered the priest and said, truly women have been kept from us about 3 days since I came out, and the vessels of the young men are all holy, and the bread is in effect common, even though it was consecrated in the vessel on this day. So the holy bread could be given to the priest, who could then give it to others after it had been on the showbread for 7 days. So this is not a violation, even though the Pharisees certainly thought it was in the first century. But now, after he went there to the priest at the place of Ahimelech, then we find that the priest gave him the sword of Goliath. Verse 8, David said to Ahimelech, is there not a spear or a sword? I have brought neither sword nor weapons with me. So the priest said, the sword of Goliath the Philistine, whom you killed in the valley of Elah, is there and wrapped up in a cloth behind the ephod. You take that. It must have been a big, heavy sword, but David took it, and he apparently used it from time to time. So now in chapter 21, David here flees to Ahimelech the priest. We have that. First he went to the judge, Samuel. He went to his close friend, Jonathan, and now he goes to the priest. And the priest gave him bread and the sword of Goliath. In verse 10, David arose and fled that day from Saul and went to Achish, the king of Gath. So he actually goes over to the Philistine country, the Philistine territory, thinking, well, he'd be out of the dominion of Saul, and maybe he'd be away from danger for a while. And the servants of Achish said to him, is this not David, the king of the land? And did they not? So these servants knew that David had been anointed king. So it must have been common knowledge throughout Israel, throughout all the tribes, that God had rejected Saul, and Samuel had anointed him to be king, anointed David to be king. And so, if the Philistines knew it, no doubt all the people of Israel knew it. So this is one of those things that's nice to just stop and pause for a second and say, oh yeah, I understand that now. So the priest said, the servants of Achish said, is this not David, the king of the land? Did they not sing of him and the songs the lady sang about David taking or killing his 10,000s? David took these words to heart and was very much afraid of Achish, king of Gath. So here he is, afraid of the king. These Philistines are planning to kill him, he's sure. So what does he do? Well, he writes Psalm 56. Let's go to Psalm 56 and we'll find out what his thoughts were during this time. Psalm 56. And, we find that this is the second lesson that he learned while he was on the run and fleeing from King Saul. He says, to the chief musician, set to the silent dove in distant lands. Now, we don't know what the song, the silent dove in distant lands, sounded like. It'd be kind of nice to know. Maybe there was a nice harmony to it. Maybe it was something like leaving on a jet plane. Who knows when I'll be back again? Something like that. Who knows? But it was a song, the silent dove in distant lands. A miktam of David, in other words, the songs or words put to music by David, when the Philistines captured him in Gath. So he felt captured. He was there in the land of Gath of the Philistines, and they were no doubt protecting him, had a guard around him, so he was basically captured in jail. He says, be merciful to me, O God, for man would swallow me up. So men, the Philistines, would swallow him up. They would try to kill him. Sometimes we experience feelings like this, where we feel like our life is being swallowed up or like there's nowhere to turn. He says, fighting all the day, he oppresses me. My enemies would hound me all day. And they were hounding him all day. First it was the servants of Saul. Now it is these Philistines in Gath. He says, for there are many who fight against me, O Most High. Then in verse 3, he tells us what he's learned. Whenever I am afraid, I will trust in you. Now, trusting in God really means also having patience. And the Philadelphia era of God's church has a time of their patience, and that we are, I think, learning the same lessons, if we are indeed in the Philadelphia era, which I think many of us believe we are, at least for a large majority of people in the Church of God. It says, whenever I'm afraid, I will trust in you. Not trusting in men, not trusting in the physical things that he has, but trusting in God. In God I will praise his word. I have put my trust. I will not fear what flesh can do to me. Now, a lot of Christians down through time have come to this point where they no longer feared what flesh could do to them. But my guess is it's not easy to come to that point. That if you see a guy with a spear or with a whip or a caged lion or wild animal, they're going to turn on you, as they did to many Christians in the Colosseum during the Roman Empire days. It would be very, very scary. But David had to learn to put trust in God and not to be afraid of what man might do to him. All day they twist my words, and their thoughts are against me for evil. So they didn't correctly quote what David said. They twisted his words. And of course, that's a very common tactic even today. They gather together, they hide, they mark my steps, they lie in wait for my life. So the Philistines maybe were waiting for him to try to escape and to run out of Gath, and they were going to then try to lie in wait and get him. Shall they escape by iniquity? In anger, cast down the peoples, O God. So he's asking for God to deliver him. You number my wanderings, but put my tears into your bottle. Now, this is an interesting phrase. There's some Bible commentaries and little books about unusual phrases in the Bible. Say that people would, when they had a terrible emotional experience and they were sobbing over the loss of a loved one or some other reason, that they would put tears in a very small bottle, and then they would remind them of the time when they suffered this terrible loss, kind of like a memorial that a person would have. But here he's saying to God, put my tears in your bottle. And he says, are they not in your book? So David knew about the book of life and the book of remembrance of the deeds of God's people. Maybe the book for judgment, you might say, he was thinking about. But it was in God's record book. David was saying that his tears were counted in God's record book. When I cry out to you, then my enemies will turn back. This I know because God is for me. So he knew that God was his defense. He could trust in God, and that if he cried out to God, that his enemies would be defeated. In God I will praise his word. For the Lord I will praise his word. In God I have put my trust. I will not be afraid of what man can do to me. Verse 11. So here, trust in God and patience is, the lesson that he is learning. He's learning he has to have patience and trust in God, not in man. I want to look at a couple New Testament verses. 2 Corinthians chapter 1 and verse 8. We are told by Paul to do the same thing, to learn to trust in God, not in man, and that when we have challenging times, which we have faced from time to time in the past, but we're going to be facing more in the future, be sure we have trust in God, not in man. In 2 Corinthians chapter 1 and verse 8, Paul recounts his accounting of when he first went to Asia and the trouble they went to, the challenges he went into. We do not want you to be ignorant, brethren, for our trouble, which came to us in Asia, and that would be over what we would call Turkey today, Asia Minor, but the western coast of Turkey along Ephesus and the seven churches and all that area. And of course, Paul was up a little bit inside in interior Asia too, in Galatia and Bithynia and some of those areas. For we were burdened beyond measure, above strength, so that we even despaired of life. Now, I don't think most of us have yet been to that point, where we were burdened beyond measure, beyond any strength to endure, and we despaired of life. Almost had desire to say, let's end this, the suffering is too much. Yes, we had the sentence of death in ourselves. So God allowed Paul to go through a very serious trial, almost to the point of death. It looked like they were going to die. And what did it say? Why? Why did God do that? That we should not trust in ourselves, but in God who raises the dead. So the lesson he had to learn was the same lesson that David learned when he was surrounded by the Philistines in Gath. Not to put trust in man, but to put trust in God. And as Paul said, not to put trust in ourselves, but to put trust in God, who delivered us from so great a death. Now, we don't have all the details. He was stoned once and left for dead, probably was dead, and God raised him up. And he had a number of other trials, put in prison. He was beaten. We don't have all those details in the book of Acts. Acts kind of skips, chapters, and not chapters, but years and months sometimes. But he says, who delivered us from so great a death and does deliver us, in whom we trust that he will still deliver us. So Paul knew he was headed through some very dangerous times, and in some cases maybe in danger of losing his life. And so he said this is a lesson he had to learn, that we should not trust in ourselves, but in God who delivers us, the God who raises the dead. So we have this really a strong admonition, but Jesus Christ said the same thing. Let's go back to Luke chapter 12 and verse 4. Luke chapter 12 and verse 4. Here we have Jesus' own words, where he says, I say to you, my friends, do not be afraid of those who kill the body. He was warning his disciples there would be those who want to kill you. They want to kill you, your physical body. And after that, have no more they can do. If you're dead, you're dead. If they mutilate you, if they cut your head off, they sever your arms, whatever, doesn't matter. You don't know it's there. Your spirit is gone from that body. You're not aware of it. But I will show you whom you should fear. We should have fear. But who do we fear? Fear him who, after he has killed, has power to cast into the grave. In other words, or into the lake of fire. So after you have died, there's one who does have the power to cast you into the lake of fire. Yes, I say to you, fear him. So we should have a proper and right fear of God. Not a fear of man, but a fear of God. We should fear what God can do to us, not what man can do to us. And so I think for the sake of time, we're going to probably cut off here tonight, but we're going to leave the saga of David and the lessons that he learned and recorded for us in the Psalms. We're going to leave him in the little prison there in Gath with Achish. And next time we'll get into the rather unusual ruse he used, or unusual tactic he used to get himself out of Gath and out of prison so that he wouldn't be killed by the king and could get back to his calling in life, which was basically to be on the run for the next 12 and a half years and to be leading a band of men through the mountains and the wilderness of Judea as he was delayed for a number of years in becoming king. Just like all of us have been called to be kings and priests, but we have things to learn, and we have qualifications to internalize before God can give us that responsibility. So with that, we'll say good night to everyone. Thank you for joining us, and we'll see you back in a couple weeks.